There we go.
Fabulous. So I am Josie. I know both Carla and Nikki through the amazing world of sport, where you get to bump into lots of people with amazing specialities. And we also all write books for the same publisher, which is really exciting. Tonight, we're going to learn as much as we can about kind of our hormones, pregnancy, and a little bit after pregnancy as well, and what we can learn from sports psychology in how to put those things we've learned in the sports world into practice to go through pregnancy, which is a journey no one really prepares you for. It kind of gets thrown at you and you often feel like you're winging it. And I think Carla's book is a really good opportunity not to feel like you're winging it, to feel like you're much more empowered and you've got some really good tools on your side to handle it. And to hear from Dr. Nikki Kay as well, who is the go-to person on anything to do with hormones, particularly female hormones, menopause, understanding what is happening to your body and why. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. If you've got any questions as we go along, we would love them in the chat box, and we'll come back to those at the end. We're going to try and keep the main part to about 45 minutes, and then we've got lots of time for questions at the end, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So drop those into the chat box as we go along. I think that's all the housekeeping. So I would love to introduce you firstly to Dr. Nikki Kay. Nikki is a medical doctor with both research and clinical experience. And as I said, a ton of experience in hormones. She particularly focuses on female hormones. She is the person I send any of my athletes, clients to who tend to have issues around disordered eating or worries about whether they're going into perimenopause, because I know they'll be really well looked after. She's an honorary clinical lecturer at UCL, and she is author of, I will find it here up to the screen, very well thumbed, full of lots of little notes all the way through it, Hormones, Health and Human Potential. And then we've also got Carla. So tonight is to really celebrate Carla's book being launched, Empowered at Birth. She is a chartered sport and exercise psychologist, which means she's been through, goodness, the full 7+ years of training to become a sports psychologist, and that she's registered with the Healthcare Professions Council. So she's got all of the training you could possibly have to be a sports psych. She is also an associate professor in applied sports psychology at St Mary's Uni. She has a research focus on stress and emotions, particularly looking at the idea of challenge and threat, which is something I know comes up regularly for athletes. And she's worked with lots of endurance and ultra participants. I've seen lots of her research that I use with my own clients in ultra and endurance work. And of course, she is author of Empowered Birth, Lessons from Sports Psychology for Your Maternity Journey. So welcome to both of you. I'm sure we're all excited about what we can learn tonight. But let's start with the pregnancy and the birth bit, because that's the bit that I certainly, when I was starting out on that journey, scared me because I didn't really know what was going to be happening. So Nikki, I guess, can you talk us through what happens to your hormones when you kind of start at conception and you go through to pregnancy?
Sure, Josie, thanks for that lovely introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. So I know we're going to focus on the pregnancy bit and the childbirth postpartum, but actually to put it in the context of this big journey, this female hormone odyssey, as I call it, that we all go through as women. Just to take you through this chart, we all start in the bottom left corner. So all our hormones, female hormones, are, as you can see, very low levels as a child. Then the hormones spring into action when we start having menstrual cycles from the age of 12 onwards, typically, and that's that central panel. So you can see there lots of fluctuations, beautiful choreography, as I refer to it. This is what's happening to your hormones during the menstrual cycle. Then if we become pregnant, we are now going to divert off up into the top left. And you can see we call this situation physiological amenorrhea. So obviously you don't have periods anymore while during those 9 months while you're pregnant. And you can see there's a big change in the hormones there, very high levels of estrogen and progesterone, courtesy of the placenta. After giving birth, then eventually the hormones will come back to that central panel, and then just to sort of complete the full odyssey, then we will all later on in life towards the bottom right move into the menopause state. Interestingly, look, that's the exact diametric opposition to what the hormones look like in pregnancy. There's a flip round of them. Anyway, so that's to put the whole thing in context of the female hormone odyssey. But Josie, to answer your question, I think the next slide, let's go through it step by step, shall we?
Brilliant.
Yeah. So starting at the very beginning, actually, we have to think about us when we were fetuses, but also as mothers, what's happening? Because actually, we, of course, it's very important, the maternal health, because our health is going to set in motion and fine tune the hormones, the hormone system of the developing baby, the female fetus. So that's really also interesting, because I know there's lots of questions, are athletes born or are they made? Well, actually, it's a bit of both, as we're going to see in a minute. So if we just look at the next bit at this early stage, what's this interaction that I'm talking about exactly in the very early stages? As I said, the baby, the fetus, is being prepared from a hormone point of view to be born into what's anticipated to be the environment. And the problem is where there's a mismatch. So I'm thinking particularly if the internal system, the communication with the fetus is, look, you're going to be born into a world where you're going to have access to a healthy diet and you're going to be able to do exercise. And then actually the child's born and now, oh, there's lots of processed food. And actually you're not going to be doing so much exercise. You're going to be driven around everywhere. That's actually one of the sort of fundamental things that we see already starting in the fetus, potentially leading to the obesity epidemic that we are having at the minute, for example. So the next slide just re-emphasizes what Josie asked me originally, where does it all start? And actually, once you become pregnant, this is what's happening. You're already thinking ahead to how your baby is going to be developing. Of course, it's got the genetic potential there, but what's going to really turn that potential on is actually the environment, the hormonal environment, milieu that the mother is definitely contributing to, of course, the placental hormones in preparation for when the baby's now going to be born. So I think the next slide, I think, Josie, we're moving on now, aren't we, to what happens at each of these stages, shall we?
Yeah, I think that's really, I mean, as someone that is a mum now and that went through that journey, I think it's really fascinating kind of what's going on in our hormones and those different elements that if you're watching this, you might be going through soon or at the moment, or it might be something potentially in the future. Or you're a coach and you've got athletes that want to become pregnant, to really help them with their hormones through that process.
So from what I've just said, you can do a lot as a mother, whether you maybe not yet or have or whatever, thinking ahead and all the support systems around you. What can you do proactively to make sure you're giving that baby the optimal incubator experience, if I can put it that way? Yeah. And so actually, these are the top tips. First of all, definitely you want to be fit and healthy yourself. So of course, needless to say, you want to be doing some exercise and eating a healthy diet, etc. Of course, we know also very important, folic acid. This prevents neural tube defects. So when the baby is developing, having a good amount of folic acid, especially in those crucial 12 weeks of when all the organs are developing, it's very, very important. Such a simple, easy thing to do. And also, of course, if there are any underlying medical conditions, those need to be sorted out. And when I was working in the NHS, I was the medical component of these medical antenatal clinics where a woman who had become pregnant or already had a pre-existing condition with thyroid or diabetes or whatever, obviously this is really important, especially the hormone issues. You want to make sure that that's really well controlled. So shall we break it down, Josie, into the different stages of pregnancy that maybe you're already familiar with, but just to sort of highlight the change in these hormones, I think would be helpful, because then that's going to feed into what Carla's going to tell you about what you can do, why you might be feeling like you are at each stage in the pregnancy, and building up to, of course, the ultimate, the childbirth. So in very early pregnancy, by the way, everyone talks about morning sickness. That's definitely, we need to get that changed. It's not morning sickness, is it? Those of you who have been pregnant, it's feeling nauseous all the time.
It's about 14 weeks of feeling totally rubbish.
Yeah, exactly.
I railed against that phrase, morning sickness.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to just call it nausea, feeling queasy. And this is the time when you're obviously not showing and no one knows you're pregnant, and actually you probably don't want to sort of be talking about, well, I didn't anyway, because it's a little bit private and it's like, you know, just early stages, you want to see how things are going, but you're feeling pretty bad. But actually, I want to reassure you, this is actually a good sign, because the reason you feel a bit queasy is because of this particular hormone, beta HCG. And that's, by the way, what you test when you do a pregnancy test and you pee on the strip and the blue strip comes up. And it's because of this hormone. And it's because the fertilized eggs embedding in the uterus at this point in early pregnancy, it releases a lot of this hormone. It is actually for survival. So it will continue the production of progesterone. Progesterone means progestation, so it keeps that nice cozy nest for the egg to embed and develop in. But the side effect of this hormone is it does make you feel queasy all the time. But the reassuring thing from a psychological point of view, which I know Carla's obviously the expert in, but actually using this as a positive thing, because I knew that this meant I was less likely to miscarry because it keeps the progesterone level high. So actually, that's already our first little indicator of this connection between the hormones and the psychology and understanding what's going on. It just sort of helpfully explains that. So feeling nauseous is a good thing, actually. Then once the 12 weeks come, then by then, amazingly, all the organs in the baby have pretty much developed. And now I think there is routinely a nuchal stand to look at the thickness of that little bit of fat at the back of the neck, to look for a chromosome, any indication of chromosome abnormalities. By the way, when I was pregnant, which is many, many years ago, that was still at a research level. And so actually I was one of the first people to say, oh yeah, I will have that scan done. So, and just also to reminder that the counting of the weeks is from the date of your last menstrual period. So that's all the weeks. And so now we're moving into the middle trimester. And this is already what you've seen. This is what the hormones during pregnancy look like, courtesy of the placenta. The placenta takes now the role of producing all the female hormones, and you can see very high levels of estrogen and progesterone, which obviously maintain the pregnancy. And also we have, in addition, prolactin and relaxin. Prolactin, as we'll find out later on, is very important for producing breast milk. And relaxing, as we'll also come to, as the name suggests, beautifully named, relaxin helps, well, not you relax, but it helps your ligaments and everything relax in preparation for birth. So I think so there we go. Those are the next, it's the pregnancy divided into 3. So we had the first trimester, second trimester, you're going to feel the baby moving and you're going to have your anomaly scan at 20 weeks. And then the third trimester is basically growth and maturation. And this is a time, again, I used to count off the various segments, again, a sort of a psychological thing. I knew that when I got into the third trimester, 24 weeks, 26, 28, then actually the baby is at least viable. Obviously, you don't want the baby to be born prematurely, but potentially now the baby could survive. But the last bit of that trimester is really important for the lungs. So that's sort of the nitty-gritty of the pregnancy, I think. So, Josie, shall we move on to?
Yeah, go to the tough bit, get to the childbirth, bit we all dread.
So, by the way, everything seemed to be divided into threes. I noticed this in general. Anyway, very slight. So there was pregnancy, was the 3 trimesters, and childbirth equally is divided into 3 stages. So the first bit is when the contractions, the dreaded contractions start. And the reason for that, by the way, why is it so painful? Is because the muscles are having to work really, really hard. And it's like a really, really bad cramp, I suppose you could say, in those smooth muscles of the uterus. But why that's got to happen is because you need the cervix fully dilated. If you start pushing before the cervix is fully dilated, obviously that's not going to end well. So that's why we have to endure those contractions. And it's really weird, isn't it? Like they're absolutely so painful, and then suddenly it's gone. It's really weird. But my mentality for that, and I know Carla's going to go into the detail, I was thinking, I'm like going through the surf and I'm getting pounded and it's coming in a regular fashion, but eventually, hopefully, I will get towards the beach. And the second stage of childbirth is when the baby is delivered. And then the third stage is when the placenta is delivered. So that's the sort of nitty gritty, I think, of the actual childbirth.
Amazing. So Carla, should we come on to you? Talk us through your book, and kind of what, I guess, why this book? It seems total genius idea to me. I went through my pregnancy and childbirth as I just started training to be a sports psychologist. So I'd done my master's and I was just starting kind of the supervised practice to do it. And it did not occur to me to use all those skills I was learning and practicing with people on myself. So when I saw what you were writing, I was just like, genius idea. What prompted you to write it?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, there's, I suppose, kind of 3 different things. So there's my research around, endurance performance, what you already mentioned in the introduction, and also kind of this idea of how do we approach demanding, potentially stressful situations as a positive challenge, and kind of that awareness that there's that cardiovascular reactivity, that, that response and the underlying, hormones that are all at play there. And that kind of, the interdisciplinary aspects there. So in my work with athletes, in my work with students, I draw a lot on that. So the endurance, performance, psychological demands of that. And then during my own kind of, maternity journey, people kept referring to like giving birth is like a marathon. I was like, interesting. And I think like not consciously at any level, I think more subconsciously, some of those seeds started to be planted. It's like, yes, you got that grit, that pain and discomfort, lots of time to think, and that pacing, those elements, that there's so much resemblance there. And then I suppose my own kind of, giving birth to my daughter was like a 50-hour odd journey, from water breaking to pushing her out, where all the birth plans went overboard. It was literally all the different psychological techniques, that mental toolbox that I teach to my students, that I teach to the athletes, they all came out. And I noticed, and I think this is where really I start to think about, there's something here. When I didn't engage with those strategies, when I lost focus, it was so much tougher. The pain was so much more intense. And when I then said, okay, re-engage using, self-talk, breathing, mindfulness-based strategies, it all made sense. And then I guess what really then hit it home to me was that afterwards, when I spoke to other women who recently gave birth, they all had these really good intentions to use breathing, use maybe some self-talk that they've learned during their birthing classes, but they didn't manage to put it in practice when the pressure hit. And I think this is why, organizations like the English Institute of Sports are really embracing pressure training. And it's just so important to narrow that, intention action gap. And I was like, but sport is such a fantastic vehicle. We've practiced all these things. So why can't we make that kind of link to feel more empowered? You actually can do this. And, that example that we got there in terms of lessons from sports psychology. So I then, contacted Andy, and it was like, that's fantastic. Like, but you need to interview some women for your book to like really make those stories come to life. And so Amy Williams, for example, interviewed, and she really talks about how she used, for example, self-talk that she practiced during her sport into practice when she's giving birth. And that was just such a recurring message from the super inspirational women that I interviewed, and their birth stories, they're all unique, and they all had kind of different demands. And like, how do they then use all these mental skills to like turn it into a challenge, a positive challenge, and not seeing as such an intimidating, daunting experience.
I really love that quote from Amy there. I'm not scared, I'm excited, because it's one I use a lot with athletes about trying to turn threats into challenges and trying to feel the changes within your body that are coming from that threat response system into something of, I am excited, this is a challenge. So can you tell us more about that kind of approach that you take?
Yes, so I've done a heck of a lot of research around kind of, you know, how do you approach something as a positive challenge? And what we kind of identified is that sport is there's always that kind of sense of uncertainty, not quite know what the outcome is, there's something at stake. And when you think about the childbirth and the maternity journey, there's so much uncertainty as well. And there's these potential kind of demands that you'd experience. So how can you then kind of tip that balance in favor of a challenge? So where you feel that you've got enough resources to manage those demands. And what we identified through our research is there's kind of those 3 key resources that you can develop using different mental tools. So one of them is kind of self-belief or self-efficacy. And there's such a nice link between sports, you know, when you think about pushing through pain and discomfort, you know, digging deep, finding like that energy when you feel really tired. And those are things that, you know, definitely during both, you know, pregnancy and, you know, if during childbirth, there's resemblances there. So you can draw on things that you've done to kind of inform that self-belief, even though you might not have given birth before. So there's definitely some nice links that you can think about there. But also that sense of perceived control. So kind of understanding what is within your control and what's not within your control. So in sports, we often make that kind of, you know, draw to the weather, like the weather is something that's uncontrollable. But, you know, when you're pregnant and when you get closer to, you know, giving birth, the baby might have their own will. They have, you know, you don't know, like they might suddenly turn, or, you know, you might have had a planned cesarean, but actually the contractions start a bit earlier, or your water breaks, you know, there's lots of uncontrollables there. So it's about understanding what's controllable and feel that you have a sense of control, perceived control, feeds into a challenge approach. And then finally, that approach motivation. So it's that idea that you're not walking away, you're not ignoring things, but actually you're tackling the demands head on. So having that proactive approach, so together that kind of feeds into a challenge approach. And through our research, we know that that has beneficial cardiovascular responses, you know, less kind of release of cortisol, which is much more prevalent in a threat. And, you know, Nikki is the expert here. Cortisol is not particularly helpful when it comes to childbirth.
Totally. And in sport, if we are really scared of it, we can quit if we need to. When you're pregnant, you can't do that. You are just heading into it. There is no choice. It's going to happen at some point. So I think being really open on that, I really like that idea of really focusing on that. Look, it's a challenge that we've got to deal with. But at least you get something really lovely at the end of it. So
yes.
There is that motivation that you get to meet your really cool baby at the end of that bit.
Exactly. And that's such a powerful psychological strategy. I mean, I'll get to psychological strategies in a bit, but I just want to share, you know, I talked about those demands when we think about, you know, what feeds into challenge and threat states. Kind of that awareness is so important of you realizing what your personal demands would be looking like. And through kind of the interviews I did and through the research on the topic, there's a couple of different demands that come up time and time again. So things like comparisons with others. I don't know if Nikki and Josie, you'd experienced that, but it's like, you know, this is what maternity journey should look like. And, you know, yours might look completely different. And it's just a demand that some people place on themselves that's can really tip that balance into a threat as opposed to a challenge. It's emotions. It's definitely that roller coaster, and, you know, how you can work with your emotions rather than working against them, you know, pain and discomfort, confidence, self-efficacy we talked about, but also that effort, you know, like finding that kind of, you know, how much that costs, that effort. And I think what's really relevant there is what Nikki talks about, those different stages of pregnancy. And actually what we should be start doing is thinking about mapping out your demands at those different stages of pregnancy, because what's then helpful, you start to develop that awareness and you actually start to use that reflection. So, you know, what do I already have in terms of my experiences? You know, maybe those first 12, you know, weeks, maybe you have that nausea and you need to rest and recover. You've got a busy job, there's lots of things happening and you're not quite sure how to do that, but maybe you've recovered from an injury in the past and you had to do that rest and recovery. How did you manage that? So it's about then using that reflection and those experiences from sport. So I think this is quite a nice exercise for, you know, the audience, those who are maybe currently on a maternity journey, is to really start thinking about what are those psychological demands that you might experience at those different stages. 3 stages, Nikki, childbirth within that 3 stages again. Yeah. There we go. Seems to be that theme. So I think that's really helpful to, before you even go into the tools, it's kind of thinking about those demands and then starting to think about, okay, hey, what do I actually have available to me already? So really take that strength-based approach and where maybe some of those gaps. So prepare for that kind of, you know, your maternity journey as if you would for a marathon. You know, you're not going to go into sports not having practiced whatsoever. So can you then take that same approach going into kind of your maternity journey?
Oh. And what are those toolkits? What are the tactics, the psychological strategies that you find can really work?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch. I don't have obviously time to go through them, so I've just kind of, I guess, pick out on 2 of those. One of the things that's very prevalent is that idea of a birth plan. So when you're pregnant, people are all kind of asking, okay, how do you want to give birth? What's your plan? What's your idea? And I know, Nikki, that you said didn't do that as such. And I think that it's helpful preparing and kind of understanding what's within your control, what's outside of your control. But sometimes what happens is that people have a very rigid birth plan. It's a bit like when you run a marathon and you want to run a sub 4 hour, sub 3 hour, whatever time-based marathon. So it's very kind of this do or fail or black or white goal. What actually happens then is it causes a lot of pressure. It can put a lot of pressure on you. So one of the kind of first things that I recommend in a chapter around goal setting is allowing yourself that goal flexibility. So start thinking about what are some of those alternative options. You can draw on some imagery or visualization in terms of what some of those alternative options could look like. So when it gets to that stage, you're already okay with it. You know, when the going, you know, you're out of, you know, energy, you know, maybe you're really tired, maybe you've been in labor for a while, it's really hard to then make those decisions on the spot. So actually I've already thought about what some of those alternatives are. Allowing yourself the flexibility reduces that pressure and helps you to focus on the process. You know, Josie, in, you know, sports psychology terms, we know that outcome and kind of performance-based goals can be helpful to give us that motivation and the training, but actually in the moment you want to think about the process, not about the outcome. So that's where goal flexibility can be really helpful to move away from an outcome, but also chunking. And I really love that example that Chrissy Wellington gave when I interviewed her about her birth story, how she linked it back to how she would break down an Ironman in kind of the different stages. And she used that during her childbirth, like she was breaking it up, and that really helped her to stay in that moment and focusing on the process and not the outcome. So again, that's something from kind of a goal setting perspective that can be really helpful. And then together you can all put that into an if-then plan. So thinking about your demands. If I start to, you know, panic about my goal, my birth plan not, you know, coming to fruition, then I will allow myself some time to be okay with that, and then I move on to my plan B. So that's quite a nice example potentially for kind of goal setting and that flexibility.
So with all that in mind, seeing you're the expert, how was your journey?
Oh gosh, yeah, I mean, I definitely had to go to, you know, plan B, C, D. So my water broke. I thought, let's try to do this without, you know, being induced. Waited out as long as I could, and you know, want to have this lovely, you know, going to the birth center, being in the pool. You know, the moment your water breaks and it takes too long, you know, that's not gonna be an option. So I cried a bit, and then allowed myself some time to be with my emotions, and then moved on to let's just focus on this. And if I need to have an emergency section, I know that's best for the baby. So I then started to think about what's my plan B, C. I was already in C, but then I managed to go back to plan B. And although I was on the drip, I managed to kind of push through that without the epidural because I was stubborn. I don't know why. But anyway, it's because, and I do attribute a lot of that to the focus strategies that I use, where I was able to kind of fight through some of that pain. But I think that's just my personal journey, and it's completely okay to use whatever pain relief works for you, if that's meaningful to you. And I think that's the consideration there for goal setting. For me, that was something that was really meaningful, also from a cultural background, knowing that my mom didn't, use pain relief. Comparisons are silly, but anyway, for me, there was something that was very meaningful to do. And chunking, oh my goodness, I drew on that so much.
Amazing. Nikki, what about yours?
Well, actually, from the very beginning, it was a little bit more complicated because I had what we now call REDs. So first of all, it was already quite difficult to get pregnant. So I had to have ovulation induction. So that was like, anyway, so I was a patient for a while, in the sense that was actually quite emotionally demanding. And then actually for the pregnancy itself, it was fine. I continued to do, well, I had no option. I was working full time as a doctor and with on call, and they will only let you off on call until you're 36 weeks pregnant. So it's like, oh, great. Anyway, but in terms of the actual childbirth itself, I am obviously the medical, the mathematical, the divide it into three, dancing, we have the bar, we have the centre practice, we have so I knew the structure of it. So I chunked in that sense. I knew that there were these parts, that's the logic, that's what's going to happen. But in terms of, like you said, Carla, setting unrealistic expectations, my birth plan was a blank sheet. Because it's like, I'm not going to set myself, oh, I want to have no pain relief, I want this and that, because it's like, one has no idea. So I left that blank, and I knew these were the stages and this was the process, but I just had to, as you said, Carla, go with it. And actually, I also had a similar thing with my first son. At one point they were saying, yeah, we're going to have to do an emergency C-section. And I just said, do whatever you need to do, because the priority is the health of my baby. As it turned out, like you, Carla, it was actually they had to yank him out with forceps, which was okay in that sense. The only when I say funny, so it wasn't an experience, I had no idea what was going to happen, but like you said, I had the flexibility. I would accept whatever was going to be the best course of action. The thing about my first son's childbirth was actually they did have to put in a spinal when they do forceps. And the funny thing, I was lying on my side, and it's like, why is my husband leaning so heavily on me? It's like, is he all right? And he had fainted on me. It's like, really? So anyway, that was a slight comedy situation. So the midwife was tending to him. Anyway, so I think that as it turned out, lots of the things that you spoke about, Carla, it was true. Although I'm not an athlete, as a dancer, we have structure, we have our goals, we have our determination. But I think the key thing was also being flexible and not putting those massive expectations on yourself that, oh, brilliant, I want it this way. You have to kind of go with the flow. Even if a husband collapses on you, it's like, yeah, well, that's part of it, right?
Totally.
Expect the unexpected.
Yeah. And thinking about that thing of expect the unexpected and talking your way through it, how do you talk about using that kind of self-talk throughout the process, Carla?
Yeah, I love that story, Nikki. So self-talk is a fascinating. We talk to ourselves like literally all the time. I'm not necessarily going to go in during a webinar into like changing self-talk, but actually what we can do from a practical point of view is we can set a self-talk plan. So again, kind of mapping across those demands that we might face, we can think about whether we need something to boost our energy, or maybe something that's more instructional. And one of the examples that I want to highlight here is that when I interviewed Jo Black, who's a climber, she drew on kind of a very instructional bit of self-talk that was very simple, a blow, hug, push. And that really helped her to focusing on pushing technique. And we know that that's such an important thing when it comes to giving birth. It's actually, you know, being able to tune in to, if you have a midwife there who tells you to maybe to slow down, or even when you have an epidural, practicing this beforehand and kind of knowing where you need to push, even if you can't necessarily feel it, kind of that practice, and then using self-talk instructions to remind yourself how to do that is such a powerful tool that people don't necessarily think about. But we do this in sports all the time, right? We use these kind of instructional self-talk statements and we practice them. So that's why I think self-talk can be really, really helpful. And I guess the key thing here is write it down, engage your support team, tell the midwife or whoever is there to remind you of those well-rehearsed bits of self-talk. It's not any mantra, it's the one that's meaningful to you that you can remember when the going gets tough. When you're under pressure, you want to make sure you can have access to that. So it is about your mantra and practice it. Think about why, what's the purpose, and then you know, it might be a song, you know, maybe you love like a movie or like Happy Gilmore or whatever, you know, to kind of, maybe you just need to cheer up. So your self-talk might be something to cheer you up throughout that. So I guess self-talk is another strategy that we can use during the maternity journey.
Cool. So we've used our self-talk, we've chunked down the birth, we've probably gone to setting A, B, C, D, E, whatever our game plan was, and we've rolled with whatever we are being told that is going to be best for us and our baby. And baby's arrived. Nikki, tell us about kind of those hormones postpartum. What is going on with our bodies at that moment?
Well, obviously now there's a massive flux, because you've seen the graph when the estrogen progesterone was sky high from the courtesy of the placenta, but now of course the placenta in the third stage of childbirth, that's not there anymore. So there is such a big, you know, all those hormones totally change. And so this has a big effect physically, of course, but also mentally. And the hormones that now come into the fore are, I've already mentioned the relaxin, which is actually important for the childbirth to let the pelvis basically have some stretch, as it were. But actually to remember that this hormone stays high even afterwards in the postnatal years. And certainly for dancers, we do love our stretching. Well, I don't do that anymore because I can't stretch anymore. Anyway, you know, so actually it's very important from a practical point of view, especially as an athlete, don't overdo the stretching at this point. And then, of course, we have prolactin comes into the fore. This is particularly for breastfeeding, but obviously it will go high even if you don't breastfeed. So it will be high for a while. And sometimes this can delay those restart of your menstrual cycles, which should restart. So the should, you know, normal play should resume in that sense with the choreography of the female hormones, but it's this gap in between when there's been this massive high levels and now they come crashing down. You can now see why this could lead to some mental and challenges, psychological challenges.
Amazing. And so what psych strategies can you use, Carla?
I was almost playing mute bingo there. I think, yeah, the postpartum period is such an important part. So it's about, again, kind of understanding what are some of the demands that you might be facing during the postpartum period. And one of the very key things is adapting to a new identity and a new you. And often it's that, well, I suppose that pacing element, isn't it? It's about taking your time to then build that back up. I think is a huge mental demand, especially, you know, people who've been playing sports all their life. All they want to do is kind of get back into playing sports. They can't wait for the 6 or 8 week check to kind of get cleared by the GP to say, well, off you go. And how do you do that? You know, I think, I'm sure Nikki can talk about that a lot more in terms of what's happening physiologically. And you need to just be really aware of those demands, and also the psychological demands, the emotional roller coasters. We know that the interaction with the hormonal changes that occur also affect our emotions. So it's about mapping out what those demands might be that you face, and then really thinking about what do I have available to me in this period to help me manage some of those demands. And a very key one is social support. And the fascinating thing is actually, especially some of the more elite athletes who I interviewed for the book, they really gave that as an example on a number of occasions where they said, well, we had to draw on, our medical support team, we had to draw on some other people to kind of help us through some of those difficult moments. So for example, when breastfeeding was a particular example, got tough and it was really painful, it was about kind of drawing in people who've gone through that before, who've been in a similar scenario, to help them. So kind of help them to boost their self-efficacy, because they've gone through it, they had those kind of vicarious experiences, which is a lovely example that actually quite a few of them gave, that drawing on that social support network, but also that element of pacing, allowing yourself that rest and recovery, be compassionate to yourself. And on the other hand, obviously thinking about goal setting, being flexible within that, is again a really key kind of psychological technique that you can bring back into that postpartum period. And then the other thing I want to share, I think, is it's for many women, it's been a humongous experience. And sometimes when that experience wasn't quite what you'd expected, a lot of negative emotions come in. It's women I've spoken to who still feel guilt years down the line about the birth they didn't have. And here's where something that the English Institute of Sport has developed after the Tokyo Olympic cycle can be quite helpful, which is that whole idea of debrief and decompression, making sense of your emotions. And I think what's really important is to not rush that process. So you have that kind of hot debrief, maybe those WhatsApp messages or that you send to people initially, and it doesn't have to be very structured. And when you're ready, you can kind of go through a much more structured approach. And one of those things that you can do as part of that, and I talk about this in the book, is actually putting a timeline together of some meaning of your birth, which is, I put my example there just to kind of illustrate that. And that can be really helpful, but also to then really think about what can you take away from your experience, because we're very good in then just parking that experience and not necessarily reflecting on the amazing achievements that we've had along the way during both the maternity journey. How did you tackle that? Maybe you allowed yourself with rest and recovery. Can you then take that back into the postpartum period? So that kind of contracting and really thinking about what can I take away from this? Also back into your sport, if you go back into your sport. So there's so many things there in a postpartum period to consider in terms of also bringing it back into the sport using those mental strategies.
I so love that. You reminded me that my journey probably started quite differently to yours too, because I went through IVF to have my daughter, and I had to give myself 36 injections throughout those 2-3 weeks of the process. And I was terrified of giving myself injections. I remember being absolutely frozen in fear, grabbing my tummy fat with this needle and just like, I know I have to do this. And I know I have this reason that I want to, but totally frozen of how do I do it? But when I looked back afterwards, I've used that so many times. If I'm on the start line of a marathon, I can do a marathon. I gave myself 36 injections. And I think what you've done there of pulling out those 4 elements, of being able to break down, yeah, look, I did this. I created a human being. I went through that process to get this, what felt like a far too large being to come out of my body. And I went through all those sleepless nights, and I've done X. Is a phenomenal thing to take back into our sport. And I'm often asked about why women in their 40s seem to be so good at ultra events. And I think one of the things is many of them have been through childbirth. They have learned how to prioritize. They've learned how to handle difficulties. They've learned how to learn from pain and discomfort, and they've been able to put it into brilliant use in their sport. So I think all of us can take a lot from that.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's such a powerful thing to, like, for example, sleep, like maybe pre-baby, you were waiting for that kind of perfect, rested state to go and do this really tough session. Well, I mean, good luck. That, you know, may happen. I think we have to be realistic. Like when you think about the elite women, they have a fantastic support team, and you know, they might have someone who looks after the baby when they wake up during the night, and so they are well rested. But we still have the hormones, you know, that there are at play in that kind of immediate period afterwards that will potentially interfere with some of that. So I think, and Nikki is the expert on this, of course, but we need to be realistic that, you know, most of us won't be potentially in that kind of elite setup to have all that support around us. So we need to be compassionate and kind to ourselves, that actually there's no point waiting for us to be completely super well rested, the perfect conditions to go out and train. It's about managing and being kind to yourself, adapting those goals. It will be, and Kelly, I think Kelly might be on the webinar, it's your post-baby PB, which I absolutely love in that paper that she published. And I think that's such a powerful statement.
Totally. I also think it's really important to think about your identity, because I've worked with a large number of women who have set themselves a huge goal in their first year after having a baby, because they want to feel like themselves again. You go from feeling like an athlete, a strong, powerful person, to a mum, and often you lose a lot of your identity. I remember very much being Hattie's mum with a large number of people that didn't know my first name. They didn't know anything about me. I was just someone's mum. And that identity is a big chunk that changes. And a lot of people try and set a very big, audacious goal. So many people that are doing an Ironman with their maternity leave. But it feels like something you might need to go through in order to get your identity back. And then people tend to realize it wasn't the most brilliant idea and drop off again for a little while. But I think actually sometimes setting that goal is helpful for helping feel like we're not just mum, and that we do still have quite a big chunk of us left, and we can do lots of different things.
I think that's from my point of view, personal point of view, for me, you know, going back to my dance class, because I've been in the dance class literally, you know, a few weeks before giving birth. In fact, my contractions for my second baby came when I was actually in the swimming pool, which was, it's like, I'm not doing childbirth, water birth in a public swimming pool. Anyway, but, you know, getting back to my ballet class, not just from the physical point of view, I wanted to get back in shape, but actually from that social point of view, and that I am me, I'm Nikki, and I do these dance classes, and, you know, but that was that was only possible because I was fortunate that my husband was very supportive, and he was the one that actually said, you need to go back to your classes, and I'll come pick up the baby from the studio, for example. So, but you know, not all of us are so lucky maybe that we have that access. And I also had my mother, who another amusing story, I had to go back to work, and it was like, yep, I've got to go back on call, and actually my mother's going to have to wheel my baby in to be breastfed, because what am I going to do anyway? So, you know, but I'm sure everybody will have, you know, everyone has a partner, as relatives, a friend, and actually you're not weak if you ask for help. You know, I think that's the other thing. So you do need to find your self-identity. Of course, you want to be the best mother you can, but actually being the best mother you can also means that you've got to continue being you see, and do whatever it is that's important for you, whether it's your sport, your dance class, I don't know, whatever it is, trying to make that time for what you need to do to maintain your identity, because ultimately your children, as I found out, the babies that were so dependent on you, they grow up, by the way. You know, and they're doing their own thing. They'll still always need you, by the way, for different things. So of course you'll always be needed, but actually, you know, then you've also got to think, your life continues, and their life will continue. So you do need to, as you say, find your identity again, but don't be so unrealistic. I'm not sure about, I mean, I've never done an Ironman and I don't intend to, but anyway, it doesn't sound like a sensible idea to me, to put that in as a goal, but something that is important to you, and getting back to what you want to do, I think, is all part of this psychology, isn't it, Carla and Josie, of reassuring yourself that you are still you as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And reassuring your children, like you want your kids to grow up knowing that you exercise, that sport is important, that we need that for a million different benefits, but for sanity, for good health. So you can be a good role model.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Encourage them, because our boys had no choice. My husband was like, they can walk, so they can come skiing. It's like, you want to involve them, but if they see, as you say, a role model, they see you doing that, and that's important for you, then they respect that. You see, so it plays both ways. So you shouldn't feel guilty that you want to do your work, or you want to do your sport, or whatever it is. I think things have hopefully changed a bit since the dark ages when I was pregnant. I do remember taking my second son in. It's like research, for example, won't wait. It has to be happening. Remember he was in my papoose and I was doing samples with the centrifuge. And I was thinking this definitely wouldn't, even then I was thinking this isn't a good health and safety thing. Maybe a little bit of sprinkling of growth hormone on him is not a good idea. Anyway, but the point is you have to do what's important to you as well. And of course you can do that and be an excellent mother and do everything.
Totally. So we've got 10 minutes left for questions. I know Lucy put something into the chat box saying how much she liked that kind of marathon analogy. And the one that she uses with dancers is that birth is an improv exercise, not a set routine. So I love that. You've kind of got some boundaries. You know where you're trying to aim, you know the direction you're going, but you can use the right imagery, the flexibility, that movement of goals in order to get what you like. So thanks for adding that, Lucy. We'd love any questions in the chat box, or to take your mic off and to ask them out loud would be brilliant.
By the way, one of the famous ballerinas, you're definitely, well, if you're not into ballet, you won't know this, and actually it's quite a sort of retired dancer many years ago, Natalia Makarova. She said her best performance was her child. That's interesting. So because it is kind of like a performance, and as you all know, I'm a dancer, and I know Lucy, and so, sport, dance, it's like those three sections of the pregnancy and the childbirth. It is like, that's also how I use my imagery, something I'm familiar with. This is the structure of the class. We have the warm-up bar, we have the center practice, and we have the big fireworks, the allegro, the jumps, the point work at the end. And that's kind of how I was thinking of it. And then this is the whole thing. And it might not go exactly, as we know, it doesn't always go according to plan. You might make a slightly wrong step, or the scenery might fall down, or other things might happen. But you know where you're going, and you have this direction.
We've got a question from Michelle. I think this is to you, Nikki. How do our hormones respond to longer term breastfeeding? So feeding's kind of over a year. And how does that compare to the hormone profile when breastfeeding soon after birth?
Yeah, well, by the way, I breastfed for ages as well. Fortunately, my son didn't always have to come into the hospital on call. But anyway, so breastfeeding is very dependent on that prolactin level, and this is often why your periods don't resume, because the prolactin is quite high. But the thing is, soon after birth and in those early weeks and months, that's the exclusive way the baby is going to get its food if you're breastfeeding. So that, of course, the prolactin will be higher. So as even though you're breastfeeding, after a year, say, still, by this time the baby will already be a little bit weaned and eating some food. So actually it's the supply demand thing. So although you are still breastfeeding, you will be doing it less, and you will be producing less milk because the baby doesn't need quite so much milk. So the prolactin will be lower. And how does that affect you overall? The prolactin might come low enough so that your periods can resume, which is really the ultimate test, that your cycles, menstrual cycles, should come back. So that's the answer. Hopefully, Michelle, that's answered that the prolactin will be very high initially, and even if you're breastfeeding for longer, the supply and demand, it will go down, so that will come slightly lower. By the way, also, I don't know if people noticed when they were breastfeeding, I certainly did the first time, the other hormone that's important for that letdown response for the milk is a hormone, oxytocin. which, by the way, is very important for childbirth, for causing the contraction of the uterine muscle. And certainly I remember feeling that when I was breastfeeding for the first time. I thought, oh my goodness, this is great. The oxytocin was also released. It's the love hormone, you know, so bonding with your child, but also nature, it's amazing, these hormones, if I haven't said that before, that it makes your uterus contract down to its other side. So, and that's the thing about the breastfeeding. It's dependent on hormones, but gradually the breastfeeding, even if you are breastfeeding still after a long time, the baby's weaned, it will gradually become less naturally anyway, because the baby won't need so much. So you won't produce so much.
And she follows up with how or what influence is there on bone health from the amount of the time that someone is breastfeeding?
Yeah, well, that will depend on the return of the menstrual cycles, because breastfeeding is a really high energy demand. It's actually, did you know, more energy demanding than pregnancy itself. Pregnancy, actually, yes, a little bit more, but not a lot more. And certainly now, actually, we disencourage women from gaining massive amounts of weight. Of course, your weight will go up, of course, but not least from circulating volume, by the way, increasing. So why breastfeeding potentially could have a negative effect on bone health is because it's such a high energy demand, and not least on calcium. And if your menstrual cycles haven't returned, so that's the interplay about the breastfeeding and the bone health and the prolactin. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yes. We probably have time for one more question. Would anyone like to take the mic off? Put it into the chat box. Okay. I am curious, is there anyone on here that is pregnant at the moment that's going through this journey or looking to be quite soon?
If you don't mind sharing.
Oh yeah.